This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast, where I'm speaking with author and expert gardener Maggie Stuckey about growing food in containers. We talk about growing a container garden of vegetables, herbs and edible flowers, and also about the inspirational history of wartime victory gardens and their legacy for today's gardeners.
I originally started growing my vegetable garden in containers 20 years ago because I moved to an apartment that had no garden space at all, just a little concrete patio, very small. And I wanted to keep growing vegetables because that's where my heart is. But I didn't know the first thing about it. So I went to the library to see if I could find a book on growing a vegetable garden completely in containers. And the fact of the matter is there wasn't one at the time. Well, that's what I do. I write books. And so I thought, okay, that's going to be my next project. And after a couple of years of trial and error in figuring out what works and what doesn't work, and most important of all, what's not worth the trouble, I decided that what I had been going through might be useful to other people. So I wrote a book on the topic 20 years ago, which was published by one of the American publishers, and they found a lot of readers. And so the books, they just kept reprinting it over and over and over again. At the time, the whole idea was kind of strange. People thought I was a little bit nuts. But what's happened in the meantime is the entire gardening industry, especially the horticultural organizations, have quickly recognized that container gardening, because we now have so many people who live in apartments, have no outside space at all, that container gardening is not weird. In fact, it's very useful. And so originally you had to read through seed catalogs like a detective, looking for keywords that might give a hint that this particular thing you're looking at would in fact do well in containers. Now that's completely different. In almost all seed catalogs have a whole section on container vegetables. You go to your local garden center and they have a whole section set aside with great big banners that say container veggies right here. So I thought there wasn't anything more to say about it all until we had this terrible, terrible COVID pandemic in 2020, and people who had never done vegetable gardens, everybody was afraid to go outside their door and out into the world, including grocery shopping. So a lot of people who were brand new to gardening thought they would try to grow a small vegetable garden in any little place they could find. And there was this incredible frenzy, which you probably happened to you folks as well. You couldn't find seeds to buy anywhere because everybody had the same idea at the same time. And I thought, this is sounding a lot like what happened in World War II with the victory gardens, when people in urban areas who didn't have gardens traditionally suddenly were encouraged to do that, to grow a garden. At the time, it was called to help the war effort. But what they were really doing was helping their family and helping the war effort. And so they kind of grabbed any little piece of land, any little piece of ground that they could to grow a few vegetables. World War II the world was at war, and the solution was, let's grow a garden. 2020 and 2021, we're actually in a different kind of war, but it was the same solution. Let's grow a little vegetable garden. And I was concerned about these new gardeners because so many of them had never done gardening before. And I kept hearing stories about people feeling disappointed because things weren't happening. They'd done all this work and they weren't getting any good food to eat from their gardens. So I decided I had some knowledge that would be helpful to them. And so that's why I decided to write this book. But I also spent a lot of time looking into the history of the victory gardens and thought it would be enlightening and also pleasant to sort of fold in stories from World War II into the chapters that teach people how to do the gardening, but also look backwards as just to some of these wonderful folks from the 1940s who faced the same kind of challenges and what they remembered about it. And I was actually able to find quite a number of people who were children during the Second World War, but remember helping out in their family vegetable garden. And 20 of them, in their own words, tell their stories in the book, which actually is one of my favorite elements of the book because they're so wonderful. They're so moving, and some of them are sad. A couple of them are downright tragic, but most of them are hopeful and peaceful. People talked about how being out in the garden gave them something to do, where to take their mind off their worries, especially if they had family members who were, actually in combat overseas. They had something to do that would help and would give them a little measure of hope. The garden kind of stood for hopefulness. You watch the plants grow. One woman said this so beautifully, much better than I can, but this is a summary. I was watching the plants grow, and that gave me hope that my husband was going to come home safe. And he did.
They were lovely stories, and as you say, a real mixture of experiences. And I can very much see why you peppered them throughout the book, because I think there are so many parallels and things that people who have maybe started growing during the pandemic or are new to gardening can kind of pick up in their own experiences and that are echoed across the decades. So there's that common thread.
Are astonishing. The parallels between how the local political leaders originally dealt with the problem in World War II and in 2020. If you compare the write-ups of the two of them, they actually use the same words, like, oh, I didn't want to start a panic, so I didn't want to tell the whole story because I didn't want to start a panic. That sounds ridiculous now, but it was said in 2020 and it was said in 1944.
So kind of moving over to the horticultural side of it, then container space is going to be at a premium in most places and most gardens. I guess the reason a lot of people are growing in containers is because they don't have that space in the ground. Although you may argue differently, because I think you're a big fan of container gardening, even against growing in the soil. But given that space is at such a premium, how can you choose what to grow?
Well, a couple of ways to think about it. Choose plants that don't take up a lot of growing space in relation to the amount of food that they produce. I call it the healthy ratio, the golden ratio. A bad example would be a cabbage. A whole head of cabbage that we would recognize as a cabbage takes months and months to reach that size, and it would take up your entire container space. Start with the understanding that container gardeners have very limited space to work with. That's a given. So to optimize that space, you need to focus on things that grow quickly, that produce their whatever it is quickly, and don't take up an inordinate amount of space and or growing time in the process. That's the whole concept of ratio. The other way to maximize that is to plan. You don't have to be real precise about this, but in general terms, move from one season to the next season to the next season, all in the same container by staging cool season plants followed by warm season plants, followed by another round of cool season plants. Now, I live in Oregon, where our growing conditions are very similar to what you folks deal with. So it is not at all uncommon to see people start with their lettuces in late February or early March. This year's been a little weird, but the green leafy plants that don't need a long, hot growing season, you can start staging them in early March and then have either in the back of your mind or actually somewhere waiting to go in. When the weather changes to the point that those cool season plants are clearly on the way downhill, start removing one or two of them, and you have already on hand a small transplant of a warm season to go right into that spot. The other day I was thinking it's a lot like choreography. If you picture a dance performance with the whole troupe on stage, some of the dancers are towards the rear and some of them are near the front, near the downstage. And as the dance progresses, the ones in the back kind of move around and they might end up in the front, and the ones from the front move to the back, or they move completely off stage for a while. And you, the gardener or the choreographer, you plan out the transition from one weather pattern to the next weather pattern to the next weather pattern, so that there's always something growing in your container garden, and there's always something else ready to slide into when what is now growing has reached the end of its productive life.
And drilling down into what you just said there, could you perhaps explain the difference between a cool season plant and a warm season one?
Well, I don't know that I can explain it in any kind of scientific way. There are plants that prefer the temperature on the cool side, and that includes all the leafy greens like lettuce and kale and chard and that wonderful array of Asian greens. Peas like the weather to be a little bit on the cool side. Warm season plants need a certain temperature level for a certain amount of time in order to produce the thing that we want to eat. Related to that is the fact that they are happy to have at least 6 hours of sunshine. So that extended period of sunshine and the warm season, those are two separate ways of saying the same thing, really. It's hot, warm, sunny days are what you need for all the vegetable plants that make a flower before they make the thing that we eat. Those are the ones that need the 6 hours sun. Heat a little bit, but not very much. Because otherwise what you'll have plants that has green leaves and doesn't have any tomatoes or any peppers or any zucchini or any beans or any peppers or any squashes, anything. You'll just have green leaves that aren't going to get you very far.
And vice versa, you wouldn't do your cool season plants. I think that's sometimes where people get tripped up. They'll try and do a cool season plant in a warm season, and that wouldn't be advisable because it might bolt. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah. The warm season starts to reach the point where the temperatures are starting to change. It's getting cool. It's getting a little bit cooler at night. Then you can start a whole nother round of cool season things. And up until you start having a deep killing freeze.
So that kind of implies that you can keep your container going for quite a long time.
In most cases, if you keep an eye on the weather, then that's the key. You can go from very early in the spring to the middle of the fall.
That's a good long time, yeah. And another thing that you mentioned about growing in pots, which I think, again, a lot of people maybe don't realise is possible or have been taught through conventional horticultural teachings that isn't possible, is that you grow root veg in containers. Is that correct?
Yes, you can. In fact, that is a good way to get around this 6 hour sunshine rule, because we would consider warm season plants, but they don't need the sunshine quite as severely as some of the others. And also, a number of them are cool seasons, so you can set that transition rather nicely into the early parts of the warm season. We might call that kind of an in-between things, like radishes, for instance. So you can start them early in the spring. They take maybe a couple of weeks to reach the size where you'd want to start harvesting them, and you can put in some more seeds in the meantime, kind of stagger out your production line. Until it gets super, super hot, they are going to manage very nicely in the early days of the warm season. And then come early September, you start a whole new batch.
The other thing that I think it can trip people up is that perhaps if they've got lots of containers or some containers, they don't really know where to start in terms of making a selection. And I wondered if you had any advice about that. Would you perhaps focus on, say, growing a range of salad plants if you're limited for space, or is it just whatever you fancy is good to go?
Well, in the book, I have what I call a checklist. 4 things to keep in mind for absolutely glorious success is make sure, whether it's a seed or you start with a small transplant, that you have chosen a variety that is actually developed for container growth. That means that the plants stay kind of small and compact rather than sprawling all over the place. For example, for both peas and beans, all the familiar peas and beans that we enjoy, they're almost all available either as bush varieties or vines. Now, unless you're really handy about building a trellis of some kind, container gardeners would want to focus on the bush varieties. Things that just by their nature grow big and tall and just kind of sprawl all over the place. If that's something that your family really enjoys, take a look through all your wonderful research capacity and find a compact version of that same thing. Now, the good news about all that is, even 10 years ago, that search wouldn't produce much, but the whole horticulture industry has jumped onto the bandwagon, I guess is the way to say it. And almost everything that you would want to grow, that you know your family enjoys, is available in a special variety that works well in containers. And the seed catalog's text will tell you which is which. So that's one thing. Make sure you're getting varieties that work in containers. The other thing is this whole thing of ratio, which we already talked about. And the other thing is, when I say some things are not worth the trouble, think about those very familiar carrots that are long and 12 inches in orange. Probably got some in your fridge right now. That type of carrot takes a very long time to get to the size where you would want to eat it. So they're not worth the trouble because you can go to your regular grocery market any day of the week, all year long, and there they are. And they're not expensive. You can find other kinds of carrots that do really well in containers. One of them is called Thumbelina. It's actually a little tiny round carrot that kids think are cute as can be. So don't buy ordinary stuff that you can get in the supermarket all year long. The reverse of that is container gardeners know that we can plant and grow and harvest special things that you will never find in the supermarket. For example, I'm very fond of an Asian green called Masuna, which you can cook in stir fries or things like that, or use raw in a salad. It's not any harder to grow than just plain lettuce, which is something you can buy in the grocery store all year long. But you'll never find Masuna there. I had a conversation the other day with the produce manager at my local supermarket because I wanted some baby bok choy. I live by myself, and I usually can't eat an entire big standard size head of bok choy before half of it goes bad. But the baby bok choys are just perfect for 1 or 2 person households. And he cannot get them from his regular suppliers. But that's okay, because I can grow it myself in my container garden.
That's brilliant, because actually there was a really neat trick in your book about planting garlic cloves. And again, that would be good if you were looking for smaller kind of portions. Could you just tell us about that? Because I thought that was really clever.
One of my rules, I find people pay attention when I say, do not do this. One of the rules is because container gardeners, by definition, have very limited growing space to work with. So your goal should be to fill every square inch of space. Even the little tiny space, you can grow what is called green garlic. That refers to the above ground growth that occurs when people plant garlic to produce a whole head of garlic. But I'm not talking about that, because that process takes 6 months. And container gardeners don't want to do that. But if you just plant one clove of garlic, to start with a regular head of garlic from the market, plant one clove, it'll take the tiniest little bit of soil space, and its first output is tall green shoots that remind you of green onions. And you can use them the same way you would green onions, chop them in a salad, throw them into scrambled eggs. They taste like onions, but they also have a little hint of garlic. And the above ground part takes no more space than a couple of chopsticks sticking in the ground. So it doesn't take much below the ground space. It doesn't take much above ground space. But you have created something that A, you'll never find in the supermarket. B, costs next to nothing because it's one tiny clove out of a whole head of garlic, which costs less than $1 to begin with. And you've done something clever. And it's easy and it's very rewarding. And even in the coldest temperatures, you can see something green growing and you think, man, that's pretty cool. I did that.
It is cool. And that kind of leads on to my final question. I was thinking about the Victory Gardens and how a lot of those were on quite spacious pieces of land. Obviously, container gardening is on a smaller scale. Is container vegetable gardening a bit of fun, or can it really make a difference?
Well, our recent history, the past couple of years, have shown us that on an individual level, it absolutely can make a difference. People use those gardens either as the major component of their kitchen plans, their cooking plans, or to fill in spots where that was their only way to get fresh vegetables. So it had a real kind of tangible benefit that you could actually put your hands on and recognize what you had done. The other benefit is, and the part about this that I love so much, is it absolutely echoes what these World War II gardeners said. We were in terrible times just a couple of years ago, and people were truly frightened, not knowing how to arrange their lives to keep everybody safe. Knowing that you could have a lovely salad because you had lettuce growing right outside the back door. You could make a really nice tomato sauce for your pasta because you're going to have tomatoes coming right pretty soon. Knowing that you had done that gave people such a sense of accomplishment, and they're proud of themselves. They tackled something they'd never done before. And the fact is, this gets kind of philosophical, but when you put a seed in the ground and it sprouts, because it will, and it grows into whatever it's supposed to be, because it will, and it produces something good to eat, because it will, you have actually provided not only beans and tomatoes and peas and onions, you have provided nourishment for your body and your family. You have actually brought life from that one container. That whole feeling that in the course of providing something simple and ordinary like lettuce, you have helped your family beat down this terrible anxiety and fear and make it through the day with smile and hopefulness for the immediate future.
Thank you to Maggie for sharing her knowledge, and thanks to you for listening. This week's shout out to a good person with a good business is the all-round amazing and lovely Adele Ford, a garden designer who's based in Kent. Adele has just branched out to become a Movement is Medicine practitioner, and if you want to experience her particular brand of magic, I've included links to her Instagram and booking page in the show notes. Next up is Dr. Ian Bedford, talking about a truly remarkable travelling bug.
I'm sure that many of us who welcome wildlife to our gardens will have planted at least one buddleia bush for the butterflies. Although commonly called the butterfly bush, the buddleia isn't actually much help for our short-tongued butterfly species, who are unable to access the nectar deep within its flowers. It is, however, perfect for the long-tongued butterflies, which includes a number of our most colourful species, such as the peacocks, small tortoiseshells, commas, red admirals, and also the stunning painted lady, a butterfly whose enigmatic life story has only recently been fully understood. For the many centuries that butterflies have been studied, it was a known fact that none of the life stages of the painted lady were able to survive through a British winter, and that the butterflies seen here each year from late spring onwards have migrated from Europe, sometimes arriving in cloud-like swarms of many thousand individuals. Once here, the butterflies would re-energise on nectar, then disperse to mate and lay their eggs on thistles, nettles and malva. Over the following weeks, the resulting caterpillars would then develop into the next generation of adult butterflies, which would become regular visitors to our gardens throughout the summer. But then, as summer drew to an end, these beautiful butterflies all disappeared, almost overnight. And each year, despite many hypotheses, nobody really knew how, or indeed where, they had gone. Recently, though, this mystery of the vanishing painted ladies has finally been solved, and has uncovered a truly astonishing annual migratory cycle. Using radar, scientists tracked the movements of the painted ladies that had hatched in the UK, and watched as they disappeared at the end of the summer. They found that over a very short period of time, the butterflies headed north, towards the Arctic Circle, before ascending to heights of up to 3,000 feet. They then fluttered an incredible 2,500 miles south to North Africa, from where they produced their next generation. These fresh new painted ladies then began the journey north again, which through successive generations would find them arriving in our gardens again the following spring. Remarkably, this delicate insect is the longest continuously migrating butterfly ever recorded in the world, and it's here in our gardens each year.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.